Well, Russians are beginning to flee the country to avoid being forced to fight in the war against Ukraine after a mandatory troop call-up began last week. Joining us live now is the political analyst and the professor at Curtin University, Joe Siracusa. Joe, what does this say to you? That these hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have been sent into battle, and if they don't do that, they face 10 years in a gulag, I suppose.
That's right, Pete. Look, it just tells you that the war is not too popular among the rank and file Russian. But look, this is typical of calling up tens of thousands of young men. And of course, they're reserving the right to call up people up to the age of 35. Some of the governors of these states who are in charge of implementing the call-up have sent out papers to people who are 40 years old. So a lot of those people are quite unhappy. Pete, keep in mind that when the Vietnam War draft cranked up, over 40,000 U.S. citizens, my age, college kids, they fled to Canada. Another 500,000 disappeared in the woodwork. And millions and millions got all kinds of strange deferments, like Donald Trump with his foot and Joe Biden with his so-called asthma. I mean, people don't want to die in these unpopular wars. And the thing is, this war will come to an end sooner rather than later, and no young man wants to be the last person to die in a war. I mean, they just resisted. So I see why Putin had to go to the reserves. He's got some other things he can go to too. I mean, he's a leader of one of the largest countries in the world, and also the chief executive of the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. So look, he's got all kinds of options. But look, it's unpopular. No one wants to die in a war that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's a lot easier to play a home game than it is an away game.
Yeah, I mean, but if that doesn't work, is the final option the nuclear button?
Well, look, Pete, the foreign minister for the European Union said yesterday in the BBC that he thought it was very likely, maybe even probable, that Putin would turn to battlefield nuclear weapons, which have been designed since the 1950s, atomic shells and howitzers and the like. I mean, he thinks that's a real possibility, and so do I, as a matter of fact. And of course, I don't expect Joe Biden to do anything about it because it's too late to resist these kinds of things. So yeah, I think he has a lot of options here. And look, I think the next debate, Pete, is going to be who lost Ukraine. I mean, it's not coming back. The place is destroyed. Commerce, finance, education. 14 million people have lost their homes. 7 million have gone abroad. I mean, no matter what happens now, and we're going to have some kind of a conclusion here, I'd have to say that that Putin has proved his point, whatever his point is. I'm not real sure all the time.
Well, I mean, and now Europe's got a winter to look forward to.
Well, look, when you start to get cold, I know you've been to Europe in the winter, it can get mighty cold there. And never forget my youth and winters in Vienna for a couple of years. It gets real cold. And if you don't have regular gas or heat or some oil coming through the door, you have to work with your little stove in the corner and with wood that you don't have. So, yeah, it's gonna affect a lot of people, particularly the Germans. They depend on the Russian energy for 40%. So this is another reason why these particular sanctions don't work very well. I mean, sanctions only work 40% of the time. And sometimes, Pete, they just bite you in the butt.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting point, isn't it, that the US may be considering sanctions against China over Taiwan. Just a consideration at this point. Is it just a threat?
No, sir. Department of Commerce and Department of State are gearing up to increase the ante, that is to add some new sanctions, which will affect the economy of China, that is its telecom and its chips and the like. And of course, unlike the Russian sanctions, the Chinese sanctions are going to have a worldwide effect, maybe even a worldwide recession, because China is all tied up in the economies of Europe, North America, and I might even say Australia too. So using these sanctions against China in this willy-nilly fashion is going to produce results that are quite unpleasant and unintended, as a matter of fact.
Did you find it interesting, though, back on Russia, Joe, that China and even India starting to put a little pressure on Vladimir Putin to to go for peace rather than expand his aggression when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, look, the great powers always look out after themselves, and India and China would like this to go away.
Yeah.
Not because they're disapproving of Russia, but this is not how they roll. They don't want to deal with this, and they don't want to help Russia at the end of it because they don't want to be labeled with the same titles or even hit with the same kinds of sanctions. So they're not so much disapproving, Pete, as they're backing away very quietly. And of course, when you watch the great powers in action, just watch their feet. If they start to leave the room, you're in trouble.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one for India, because it buys most of its weaponry from Russia. It gets it at a good price. And, if that's now all of a sudden in jeopardy, where does it go?
Well, it's not really going to be in jeopardy because the military-industrial complex of each of these great powers seems to do pretty well, whether the wars are popular or unpopular. I mean, the United States, the military-industrial complex did very well during the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, and all the rest of the wars. Same thing in Russia. And India likes to buy their military stuff from Russia. They have in the past. It's very reliable. And, of course, we got new players on the stage. We got the Turks who are doing a pretty good job in producing arms. And, of course, the Chinese can produce their own arms. So the arms industry, or what they used to say dramatically during the First World War, Pete, the merchants of death never suffer in war.
Joe Siracusa, good to see you after a few weeks away. We'll talk to you soon.
Good to